Yeah, I just we'll go to questions in just a moment, but I thought maybe I'd just kind of quickly recap the value proposition that we're talking about here for diagnostics. Generally speaking, of course, we're talking about diagnostics that do everything from screen wide populations of patients to offer a specific diagnosis, offer a staging of a disease information or prognosis, identify treatment, monitor treatment for follow-up care. And here, of course, in this specific area that we're talking about, diagnostics that offer very increasingly specific information about the infection that a patient has. Then the evolution of technologies that are basically bringing these results more quickly, that are offering technologies that can be used closer to the patient, also aiding in the quicker analysis and disseminating this technology outside of highly specialized laboratories, enables them to be used more widely, as our previous speaker mentioned, in a number of different settings. And this has not only the result of having better outcomes for individual patients, often lowering healthcare costs, but also has the public health implications of being able to track, in a better sense, the epidemiology of outbreaks and where we're going with antibiotic resistance in this case. So I just wanted to kind of summarize that value proposition that we see here from diagnostics, and obviously it's a field that continues to evolve. So I have a few questions that I could probably throw out there, but I'd look first to the audience. If you have follow-up questions for any of our speakers, including our last one, who didn't get our own personal session yet. Any other questions? Yes. I don't know if maybe either of our more public health-oriented speakers maybe want to comment on that.
I'll start by. Is this on? I'll start by saying that that's the area that we've been most active in. We know that this is, as I talked about, a lot of the major sales are, the majority of the sales are related to antibiotic misuse and overuse in animal production. With regard to the advocacy activities we've been active in lately, it's been with regard to the FDA using their voluntary authority to recommend that that be withdrawn from animal production, as well as trying to make sure that these companies are reporting how much their sales are, the level of their sales, the types of antibiotics they're using, and for what animals they're being used for. So it's a major public health issue for us. We know that this resistance in foods contributes to the resistance in humans, and I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, I can add a specific example for Campylobacter infections in humans. There was a quinolone, one class of antibiotic that was being used in veterinary medicine, which, as was just mentioned, is not monitored. So we really don't know the scope of the use. But this one drug was introduced. It was pulled, I believe, in 2005 because we saw rates of resistance increase in humans. There have been excellent links in data from Europe and even now in the United States showing that classes of drugs that have medical utility in humans, when they're used in animals, can lead to transmission of resistance to humans. And in European work, you pull that out and you can see the resistance go down. So we feel this is an extremely important area because we really don't know. A lot of antibiotic use, the majority of it is not monitored by trained veterinarians.
Yes.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Has there been any thought about research into developing egg animal-specific antibiotics that would be not used on humans as a way to combat that?
I'm not really familiar. I do know there are compounds used in the agricultural industry that do not cross over to human use, but I don't have a lot of information on that, and I have no idea what the state of the research is at this point.
Other questions? Yes.
I think early on in the panel, it was mentioned that somewhere in the last 3 or 5 years, there's only been one new antibiotic that's been developed and approved by the FDA. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on where in the pipeline of drug development and approval that the problem really lies.
So this is the one. I don't know why I'm using it. The IDSA had a paper published in April of this year by Dr. Helen Boucher in Clinical Infectious Diseases that tried to look at the 10 by 20 initiative and the progress that was occurring. And the group that worked on that found that there were 7 antibiotics in development potentially for some gram-negative rods, but they were not very far along. So the pipeline is still pretty meager, and we don't know which, if any of those medications will make it to be effective in patients.
So
Do you want to add?
Incentive to actually develop these drugs, or, I mean, what's the actual issue?
Exactly. There's a lack of economic incentive because, let's face it, an antibiotic is used for 7 to 14 days, whereas a hypertension medicine is used for the rest of that patient's life. So the value of one patient to a pharmaceutical company for an anti-infective is just not there.
And what about the GAIN Act that was recently passed? Is that expected to alleviate some of this problem, and have we seen any of that come into place yet?
So IDSA has advocated for a combination of what's called push and pull strategies. So this is just one piece. It provides extended market exclusivity so that a company that invests the millions of dollars it takes to develop a new drug will have a longer period of time where their investment is protected. It's just as you say, I mean, we're working to shorten all our courses of antibiotics. It's precisely the opposite of the economic model for every other drug that's been a great boon for the statins, hypertensive drugs, among others.
Just in the back.
So moving out of the United States, obviously a major problem worldwide is malaria. And so do any of your groups work on that issue?
So the answer is yes. Today we were focusing on antibiotic-resistant drugs, but we do have resistance issues in other major sets of organisms like viruses, influenza, HIV, for example. Malaria is an excellent example where we're down to really one class of drugs, and that's already threatened in Southeast Asia. So these other areas are also of concern. The IDSA has a global health center, and so these are certainly problems that we're interested in.
Yes.
So one of the challenges the drug developers talk about is the ability to recruit patients for clinical trials for these antibiotics. I was wondering if you could speak to the role that new diagnostics could play in helping drug developers actually get the patients they need to do the trials to test that the drugs work or don't work.
Sure. So that's actually come up where pharmaceutical companies have approached us to do exactly that, develop a diagnostic that may help them narrow the funnel of patients that may go into a trial. The problem for diagnostic manufacturers is that's usually not a sustainable model, right? You supply them for 2-3 years during their clinical trials, and then they don't want to use that. They want to use their drug widely and don't want to apply that filter on the front end. So it hasn't been economically viable for a company like Alere, at least in my case, to go down that path for these bespoke diagnostics for one pharmaceutical.
But to follow on that, would those products be useful just to inform the use of antibiotics once they are on the market? Is that not seen as a...
They could be. The examples that have been brought forth to us, we didn't see that tie-in. It was really more of an aid in boosting enrollment in a cost-effective manner.
Yes.
So thinking about the causes and the high prevalence of like MRSA and other antibiotic-resistant infections, would you say that the problem lies more with the methodological shift to non-judicious use of prophylactic therapies, or just the overall lack of access, for universal access to testing that's available?
It's a very complex problem, and we're not going to solve it with one approach. So we really feel strongly it takes a series of approaches in order to tackle each step in the process, from the time we initially see the patient and can then rapidly identify if that patient needs antibiotics, to being able to understand exactly what organism they may have. It's a process, and it's not one piece is the most critical.
Right. It's just that, the medical industry has this sort of stigma that doctors drown their patients
there's no question that targeted tests would help to diminish the indiscriminate adding of antibiotics. You know, we've learned, and so we're in a tough situation, we've learned that for really any serious infection, be it bacterial or fungal or otherwise, the faster we get the effective medication into the patient, the more individuals survive in data that I think Dr. Peterson showed. So identifying what's going on, then we would be able to move away from broad spectrum antibiotics to more narrow use of antibiotics. I mean, as a clinician, I love it when I get the call that the patient has the sensitive Staph aureus and not the resistant Staph aureus. And when I get that call much earlier in the course, I am so delighted to get off vancomycin and get on to a more narrow spectrum antibiotic to treat that patient. I mean, those are very welcome additions to clinical care.
So I agree, this is very, very complex, and we need some novel ideas on how to incentivize U.S. healthcare to really try different stewardship approaches. The traditional way is to hire a physician or a pharmacist and put them in the ICU, but that costs money and very difficult. The Chinese, interestingly enough, implement a very heavy-handed approach. August of last year, they across the country said all hospitals, adult and pediatric, had to cut their number of antibiotics in half, and they had to cut their antibiotic use about in half. But that would be very challenging to do in the United States. I think that there are some great potentials for the next few years by using information technology tools and diagnostics, but there is going to have to be a partnership between the government and the healthcare to do this, because these are often perceived as very expensive for the hospitals, and the hospitals are just trying to cut wherever they can.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lily Khan, and I'm from H. I didn't necessarily have a question, but I wanted to offer a perspective that I really think helps to drive home the need for more rapid diagnostics. We represent local health departments, and so our members, the local health departments, work really closely with the state health department, the healthcare providers in their local communities, or the private providers. And I know that one of the things that keeps them awake at night is getting that telephone call from whether it's the hospital or some other stakeholder in the community saying, we've got a disease that looks communicable, it looks infectious, whether it ends up being tuberculosis, like the multidrug-resistant tuberculosis, or the extremely drug-resistant, or CRE, or MRSA. But again, one of their fears is getting that telephone call saying, we've got an organism, looks infectious, and all of the drugs that we're still trying to characterize it and better learn about it. And the drugs that we think should be working aren't working. And the more, again, quickly we can develop, be able to identify and develop new technologies to help identify, can also help our health departments and work with all of their community partners to better implement those infection control practices that we all do such a nice job of discussing.
Thank you. Appreciate that perspective. And maybe as one, near final question, I would throw then to our presenters from our manufacturers here to comment in regards to that comment on what are kind of the key challenges going forward in terms of developing new technologies and bringing them to market more quickly and continue to make progress in the diagnostics area. Either one of our manufacturers.
I can start. So one of the first challenge is that you have the discovery of all these great markers, and whether or not they have a clinically relevant role at that period of time determines whether or not they'll actually make it to a product at that time. So what happens, and this happens just right now with these respiratory viral panels, so you have these panels that you've made and you've taken them through the FDA, they've gotten cleared, and all of a sudden you have H7 and 9 popping up, right? And so what would be nice is to be able to have the flexibility to be able to add in these new markers into the panels and be able to detect those very quickly for these local public health labs. And so to streamline that process would be very helpful for manufacturers.
And I guess along those same lines, to me, there's really two things that would be helpful. One would be a bit more of a predictable engagement and timeline through the FDA. That would be really helpful in us justifying the investment in new tests that quite frankly, have great applicability in this country. The other is on the reimbursement side, that if we deliver a truly value-add diagnostic that helps in the big picture save money, sort of to Dr. Peterson's point, we need to have the reimbursement there so that we make the right decisions from a holistic perspective, not just a laboratory budget perspective.
Great, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, not because we've run out of things to say, but just because of schedule. Some of our speakers may be able to stay around and chat a little more. I know some of us from the association will be. So I want to give one last round of applause to our speakers, and thank you all as well.